and oolong tea. More on the green side than on the dark side, and for my taste it's excellent. And the tea I served you in my office, I would say, was a more complex tea than this. But this has a certain perfection, just a... So, permit me, I will look for it, I hope I find it. Already very nervous because I don't see it. Here it is. I'm willing to stake my friendship on this tea. I don't think I will disappoint you. I hope I will not disappoint you.
How did you feel, Walter, when presumably you received a telephone call and then you discovered that it was the Nobel Prize in Chemistry?
Well, first you should ask Mara, because in fact I did not, the call was meant for me, but it was received by Mara.
So the phone rang, it was a little before 5, I think, something like that. And a very pleasant voice said, "Good morning, this is the Royal Swedish Academy." And I don't know that it has ever happened to me before or since, but my jaw literally dropped, still hinged, but dropped. And I could say nothing to Walter. I passed over the phone. I was unable to speak. And then Walter began to talk.
And he said, Walter, this is, his first name just slipped my mind, this is Roos. And I thought I should perhaps also talk with you for a minute just to make sure that you understand that this prize is in chemistry and not in physics. And I think there's no question that the work that has turned out to be the most useful and fruitful is the work on density functional theory. And that work was begun literally in his office. I had he kindly offered me one of several desks, right?
I inherited an office which was a very magnificent office with an old oak tree desk, gigantic, so 8 times the usual desk. And so I put Walter on one side and me on the other side of that desk.
That's
we were
great.
Facing each other
Right.
across this gigantic desk.
I was wondering in particular about Schrödinger and whether you actually ever met Schrödinger.
I never met him, but I have, of course, an enormous admiration for him. My own work in the area of density functional theory is entirely built on Schrödinger's work. It transforms it and looks at it from a different perspective, which has allowed one to make progress in areas where his own formulation was hindered by insurmountable practical problems. But I consider him as an ancestor, scientific ancestor.
Did he have young people whom he trained? I cannot think of many of them.
Not
He
very
was
much.
a very lonely person in a way.
He was a very lonely person in most respects, not with respect to women. Most of his life was married to the same woman, and at the same time, most of his life had some other woman living with him. Erwin Schrödinger, in the second half of the 20s, proposed an equation that would govern the behavior, quantitatively govern the behavior of electrons and nuclei in atoms, molecules, solids, liquids, plasmas, you name it. This equation describes the physical world that we experience, all aspects of the physical world that we experience on Earth. And this equation, as I said, can be written down in one line. when you see a living organism, for example, a human being, and as far as we've been able to confirm the behavior of a human being is also entirely governed by this simple little equation that Schrödinger wrote down. This is, I think, words like miraculous and preposterous come to mind. This is truly extraordinary. My work, I showed rather surprisingly that a knowledge of this density distribution of the electrons had implicit in it all specific properties of this system, including the solution of the Schrödinger equation. Quite astonishing, and so astonishing that even almost all leading theoretical chemists initially rejected it as almost absurd. My father, I remember my father working incredibly hard just to keep his head above water. I did not see that much of him for that reason, except weekends. My mother was, for that period in Europe, a rather exceptionally highly educated woman. It's really my mother who assumed the responsibility for the education of my sister and myself. And with the exception of mathematics and science, I got an excellent education. Mathematics was a disaster, not only in terms of the instruction that was offered, but also my response to that instruction. My favorite subject by far was Latin. I liked it for its simplicity, for its concise structure, and it just suited me very well. My mother was very good in Latin. I remember once during a holiday she had to remain in Vienna and I was somewhere in the country, and we corresponded without much difficulty in Latin.
That's remarkable.
I loved that. In any case, she was altogether a really great lady.
The day when you came home from your Jewish school in Vienna and discovered that your father had been taken by the Germans and that your mother was in a terrible state, of course.
A bunch of hooligans had come in. They were known to my father, young people, and they just smashed up everything they could in a totally vandalistic way. They'd taken some, porcelain that they found standing here and there and thrown it into a glass mirror. They'd taken drawers and just emptied them out, smashed them on the ground, and so on. So the whole place looked absolutely terrible. And yes, my mother was very distraught. This was incidentally in connection with the so-called Crystal Night.
Yes.
Where, of course, all kinds of terrible things happened all over Germany. In that school, I met these two very influential teachers, very influential for me. Professor Noel and Professor Sabbath. They taught respectively physics and mathematics. I found out about 10 years later, the war was over, I already was studying physics, and I read a biography of Einstein, and I come across this man's name. It turns out he had been a teaching assistant of Einstein's. Suddenly, you know, I understood why this man had such a broad grasp of the subject. We met, and he said, well, what I'm proposing is that in view of the circumstances here in this country, we teach a rather different course, or I teach a rather different course. No examinations. We'll do interesting mathematics. And if you agree, you will simply get the same grade at the end of the year that you came in with. So nobody disagreed. And that's how it was taught. And it was just, you know, inebriating for me. Here, I had been drilled in taking hundreds of square roots and hundreds of cube roots and whatnot. And this man was introduced us to complex variables. And, you know, de Moivre's theorem. And suddenly, you know, we were on a completely different plane.
Was this a turning point for you?
It really was. It really was. Well, it was the combination of these two teachers, because there was no thought in my mind until that moment of becoming a scientist. I had gotten, for the first time, a summer job at Polaroid in the area that then was called solid-state physics. That gave me an opportunity to talk with Professor Van Vleck about solid-state physics. And then he asked me to teach his course.
Do you think it was Van Vleck's request that you should teach his course that guided you into solid-state physics, or was it a conscious decision that you wanted to move away from nuclear physics and that you saw your future in the solid state?
Yeah, both. I think without Van Vleck asking me, it would not have happened. And then I did feel, and I do not want that to be heard as a criticism of Julian Schwinger, but I did feel a tremendous inferiority complex working with Schwinger, who had an incredible speed of thinking and working, so that typically I would find myself you know, working on something for a week and running into a roadblock and present it to him, and in 15 minutes it was resolved. And when that happened a number of times, I said to myself, maybe that's not an area in which I can contribute very much. So and solid state I found it very interesting.
And you spent quite a lot of time at Bell Labs.
Yes, we had medical expenses that I was not really able to deal with. I communicated with my professor and friend Van Vleck and asked him if he could perhaps recommend me for some summer job, and he recommended me to people at Bell Labs, and they took me there. First year I worked in Bill Shockley's group. Bill Shockley is, of course, the co-inventor of the transistor. It was a very exciting time. The transistor had been invented just a few years earlier. That invention, one must say, dominated everything in the laboratory correctly. These continuing exposures to Bell Labs really made me into a very serious solid-state physicist. Before that, I was a bit of an amateur. And it's a little foggy. I was appointed as the director in March 1979. I felt from the beginning it was a fantastic opportunity. Well, I'm coming into the foyer of the Institute for Theoretical Physics. There are approximately 50 people working here, all theoretical physicists, the great majority from elsewhere, not from Santa Barbara, and they come from all parts of the world. This is the Deputy Director, Kohn. Most of the offices are occupied by visitors who are here for periods of a few weeks to a few months. So maybe you can give an idea of how the Institute functions, and perhaps also indicate the growth in several respects.
The central idea behind it, I think, originally was that it would bring together people from different areas of physics, perhaps from sciences outside of physics, to talk to one another in combinations and in directions to which they were unaccustomed. The question has arisen, does theoretical physics have any substantial light to shed on the areas that overlap biology? And I think the ITP is going to play a central role in exploring that issue. If a department of physics wants to do that, it has to go out and hire, as you know, one or probably several faculty members, and they've made a commitment then for decades. What the Institute can do is, and has done and is continuing to do, is to organize research programs that last several months to bring people together to explore these questions. And after the program is over, those people go back to their own institutions and enrich them, and hopefully in ways that the Institute has provided. And there is no long-term permanent commitment, and we'll see whether theoretical physics has an important role to play in biology or not.
I might just tell a little story. Since we didn't have a full operation in the first half of our first year, and since I treat public money very parsimoniously, I didn't spend the money that we were given. At the end of the year, we had a substantial amount of money left over. What to do with it? Well, to me it seemed quite obvious to return it to the National Science Foundation. And by the way, I know that we created something of a sensation in Washington by perhaps being the only organization that ever returned money to them. The Institute started in 1979, and that happened to be the 100th birthday of Albert Einstein. So a good deal was made of that coincidence, that the founding of this institute was perhaps one of the best ways to celebrate the gift of Einstein to the physics community. So approximately, perhaps 25, 27 years ago, I was walking across my campus at the time, which was the San Diego campus of the University of California. It has a rather modest fountain on one of its plazas, and I was walking by that fountain and noticed a photographer standing there, a camera on a tripod, and working on the camera, and there's a young woman who is carrying things for him, and he's about to take a picture of this fountain. And as I walk by, I'm an amateur photographer, and I know some of the basic rules, and I see that the sun, which was not very high, must be shining into his camera. And I feel, my God, he's taking this fairly seriously. And should I point that out to him? Yeah. Or should I just say it's none of my business and walk by? So I have this struggle of conscience, right? So conscience versus manners. and finally conscience won. And I stopped and and I said, excuse me, I know it's none of my business, but I just want to make sure that you've noticed that the sun may be shining on your lens. And he did not really turn around to acknowledge my presence, but he just said, thank you very much, and went right on with his business. Well, the next day I went to a seminar in another field, in geophysics. And they had the most beautiful seminar room on the campus. And to my surprise, I see the same man coming in, and he is again taking some pictures of this seminar and the beautiful furnishings and so on. So I leaned to my neighbor and said, tell me, who is this? And he says, oh, this is Ansel Adams. One of the great American photographers, I think, of all time.
Walter, do you believe in God?
This, again, you see, it's a one word, right?
Yes.
In God. If I'm given a choice between saying yes or no, I would not say no, and I'm prepared to say yes. But I need some other things that I cannot base on science. Most importantly, perhaps, moral principles. But even from within science, I'm taken to a conclusion of something important that is outside of science, namely the more science teaches us about the nature of the world, the physical world that we live in, the more astonishing the picture becomes. And it is, again, just psychologically not acceptable to me to imagine that this simply, it just so happened by itself. I do not believe, but I mean, I certainly do not believe in, let's say, ideas such as are expressed in creationism, or I do not believe in let's say, the traditional biblical description that the world was created in 6 days and that man was created a few thousand years ago. Inconceivable for me that as a scientist I can accept this in any kind of literal sense. I do want to add something to this, and that's has been my position for a very long time. I think religions can do a tremendous amount of harm. Let's just mention September 11th, but let's go back to the terrible things that happened in the Middle Ages, Inquisition, whatnot. I am profoundly committed to complete intercreed tolerance, and if I had a choice between a conviction that either religion has to be abolished or it will continue in the sense in which it has, of terrible, yes, not a matter of intolerance, enmity to the point of death, I will choose abandoning religion. It is not worth that. An issue that I've been very interested and quite active in has to do with the continuing growth of world population almost entirely in the less developed world. My active interest in this goes back about at least 30 years. It turns out that the most important direction in which to work towards stabilizing world population is to improve the educational level of women. This has been shown to have just absolutely dramatic effects. You add an extra grade to the average educational level of women in an underdeveloped country, not only does it make the women's life better, enriches them, gives them opportunities for their own individual development, but it also automatically leads to a decrease in the number of children that families have.
Let me bring you now to some more local issues. I know, and many of your colleagues know, of your strong opposition to the management of the Department of Energy Laboratories by the University of California. Would you like to say a few words about that?
It's an utterly inappropriate function of a university to be developing weapons of mass destruction. It's a profound subversion of the mission of a university. And so what we have called for is not the cessation of use of nuclear weapons, but the participation of the university in the development of nuclear weapons. The university not only participates, but in a very significant sense legitimizes this work, and I've found that totally unacceptable.
Your theoretical work is widely known and respected and used in both physics and chemistry. I once looked you up on the Web of Science, and I found that your work had been cited over 14,000 times in the scientific literature, which I believe is far more than the citations, the average citations for a Nobel Prize winner. And I'd like to focus now on the remarkable theorems and approximations that you presented in 1964 and 1965, which led to the modern development of density functional theory, and for which you won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1998. Suppose you had to explain your work to an audience of non-specialists who know the fundamentals of physics and chemistry at the university undergraduate level. How would you explain what you found?
First, I want to just say that the person who's talking with me is John Perdue, who is a very old friend of mine, old in the sense that we've known each other.
And in another sense?
No, not in the other sense. On the contrary, I mean, he represents, I might say, the sort of new generation of density functional experts. By the way, I apologize to whoever hears this for my bad voice, because I'm just getting over a cold, and this had to be done at this time. So, coming back to John's question, how would I explain it? I'll simply give I'll try to give a little historical background, and that will, I think, indirectly answer the question. In my first job, I became acquainted with an experimental group that worked on what's called the electronic structure of alloys. Now, by electronic structure, what we mean is the following. Any sort of piece of matter, or any molecule for that matter, consists of nuclei and electrons. The nuclei are much heavier than the electrons, and so for a first approximation, one can assume that they move so slowly that they can be treated as momentarily stationary, and then the electrons move among these nuclei. And this motion leads to a kind of an equilibrium situation of the electrons, and that is called electronic structure. So my colleagues in Pittsburgh, my first job, they were working on experimental aspects of electronic structure of alloys, particularly copper-nickel. That was a very interesting and much studied alloy. So I've had this background going back to about 1950. In 1963 or 64, I came to Paris, and I wanted to study this question of the electronic structure of alloys further, and I had certain ideas that I wanted to explore. I read the literature, the metallurgical literature, and I noticed that the metallurgists, in some qualitative rules, referred a great deal to the density of the electrons in at different points within this alloy. And that changes from point to point. Near a nucleus, because of the attraction, that density is high. Far away from all nuclei, the density tends to be low. But that's a very crude way of describing it. In fact, the density has a very well-defined value at every point in the alloy. So I saw these rules and involving the density, and I noticed that the metallurgists found a simpler way of roughly thinking about this in terms just of the density distribution. So that seemed interesting to me, but I think nobody had asked the question whether, in principle, one can formulate the theoretical problem of electronic structure completely and exactly in terms of the density. And I think that was really the essential point in this work, to ask this question: can one formulate a theory of electronic structure fully in terms of the density? It seemed completely ridiculous to think so, because traditionally, for an alloy or a molecule, for DNA or for methanol, in a traditional description, you had a very, very complicated function of many variables, so-called Schrödinger wave function. And the density is a quantity that has a value at every point in space. So since space is three-dimensional, it's a function of three variables. So it seemed a little bit ridiculous to think that one can formulate the theory entirely in terms of a function of three variables, where the conventional theory was formulated in terms of functions of, well, depending on the size of the system. For the hydrogen molecule, 6 variables, but for a little piece of alloy, 1 billion variables. But on the other hand, there was this qualitative success of the Thomas Fermi theory. There was the qualitative success of the metallurgists. So we were trying to kind of understand the logic of this. And it was in this search for harmonizing these apparently contradictory viewpoints that we were able to demonstrate that at least in principle or in theory, the density distribution of the electrons in an atom or molecule, there are some points around which you tend to find many electrons and other points around which you find few electrons, and that this distribution should contain complete information about the system seemed, on the one hand, not implausible, on the other hand, absurd. Just chronologically, then, I want to, at this point, mention that after working on this for a few weeks in Paris, where I was on sabbatical leave, I had become acquainted with a young, very brilliant physicist by the name of Pierre Hohenberg, and he had just finished a project and was sort of a bit at loose ends, and I said, well, how would you like to join me on this? And so he said, okay. And so he came in on this, and so from a certain point on, we proceeded together. Well, after this first work, which was a rather theoretical work, done in Paris with Pierre Hohenberg, I came back to my home base in San Diego and was joined there by another very brilliant young man who was my postdoc, my new postdoc, Lou Sham, S-H-A-M. My head was still very full of this surprising result that we had gotten in Paris. So we needed to define a project on which Lou Sham would work with me. The work consisted really very specifically of two published papers. One with Hohenberg, the work was done in Paris, and it was highly theoretical. And after that work, I didn't see much of a possibility for useful applications. But then, when I came back to San Diego and started working with Lou Sham, we transformed this work with Hohenberg into another form, very similar to the work done by Hartree, but this time it was in principle exact. And of course, if something is in principle this or that, that doesn't mean anything for applications. Applications, you have to be concrete. But it was possible to make a concrete, take a concrete approximate step, which took one considerably beyond the work of Hartree, without making it more difficult to do the calculations. So I would say at that point, we did feel that it was going to be practically useful and would be influential.
Now, you've already answered this question in part, Walter, but can you tell me about how you found the proof of the theorems?
Well, again, it's an example how science is not simply taking one logical step after another. It is just there are a lot of personal factors involved, personal history, and so on. We wanted to prove something about a system that was so complicated that one could not explicitly fully describe it. So how can you prove something about a system you can't really describe? That's an interesting sort of a logical issue, which of course has come up in physics many times in other so the way historically general results have been obtained for systems that are so complex that they cannot be described in every detail is by the use of some general fundamental law of nature, let us say. So you had to if you wanted to prove something as general as the conjecture that the density distribution in the lowest energy state can fully encapsulate everything about the system, you had to use some general principle. Well, there is a class of general principles called variational principles. That's a mathematical term, and I happen to have worked on those before. I was pretty familiar with the whole philosophy of these variational principles. So I said to myself, well, we're talking about the lowest energy state, and there is a beautiful variational principle known about that. Can I use that in some way to prove this result? And then it turned out, yes, it was actually not terribly hard. You just had to have the thought of trying to use it. Now, you had to ask something else. Why would this be? Why would this eventually become as popular as it is now? You mentioned the large number of citations, and the reason for that. The traditional methods, because in some sense they try to track every single electron, just get out of hand when you're talking about systems with too many electrons. Too many depends on which system you're talking about, but something like 10 or 20 or 30. Just too many electrons. You're working in a space of a large number of dimensions. Three-dimensional space is bad enough, right? But if you're talking about 100 electrons, you're working in a space of 300 dimensions. Can you imagine that? No, nobody can imagine that. But the density distribution is always something like just an ordinary cloud, no matter how big the system is. So the DNA molecule is pretty formidable. Well, it's just like a very long cloud. But you're not working suddenly in a space of billions of dimensions. So it has turned out, and we recognize this fairly early, that it would become particularly useful for relatively large systems with many electrons, for which the traditional theories just became unmanageable, too complicated and unmanageable. And that maybe I can show at this point a picture. So there are now literally thousands of applications. But here's something was given to me by an Austrian friend, and inside that cage you see sort of an artist's conception of a molecule, the methanol molecule. Perhaps something like 50 or 100 atoms involved. So a system like this is outside the present range of traditional methods that were trying to track each of these electrons, but it can nowadays, this is from 1996, systems of that complexity can now be very easily studied theoretically, and not only in their zero temperature frozen configuration, but you can also study what happens when you heat this system and all the atoms begin vibrating slowly. And there's a very good video made by the authors, which I've seen, which shows you how these vibrations take place and how various chemical bonds form and break in the course of these temperature vibrations. So I think from a practical standpoint, that's probably be the most important contribution of this approach to chemistry and to physics, namely the ability to study hitherto quite inaccessibly large systems and this has, opened up some important areas, going back to alloys, but in chemistry, going to such very complicated structures as this structure. By the way, this process is of interest as a possible step in the production of gasoline from methanol.
Part of the real beauty of the theory is that you can find both in chemistry and physics you need the energy surface. You need to know how the energy of the system depends on where the nuclei are. And once you have that, you can do all kinds of detailed analysis of equilibrium geometries and nuclear motions and chemical processes and phase transformations. It's really very powerful information. Can you tell us in a more general way how and why you collaborate in theoretical research? And have you ever collaborated with experimentalists?
Generally speaking, you'll find that theoretical physicists are a rather collaborative bunch compared to, for example, mathematicians who tend to be loners. Is there a deep explanation for this? I don't know. But it is a remarkable fact. Now, speaking about myself, I just enjoy collaborations enormously. I feel very lonely when I work totally by myself. Somebody once asked me if I were to be like Robinson Crusoe on an island, all by myself, but with all library facilities and computers, but the only thing missing, interaction with other scientists. Would I continue to do scientific work? Now that may sound like a difficult question, but for me it is very easy. The answer is no. When you take the human element out of it, it loses interest.